Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me all right? Reasonably well in the back, I hope. Okay, so I want to welcome you all here to what is another lecture in the series of lectures that are being graciously sponsored as part of the Mellon Islamic Studies Initiative of the University of Chicago Divinity School. And first and foremost, want therefore to express thanks both to the Divinity School for organizing the initiative and to the Mellon Foundation for their generosity in funding it. And having said that, it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, who is here as a visiting professor as part of that initiative, Professor Monica Ringer, who is an associate professor of history and Asian languages and civilizations at Amherst College. We've known each other for many, many years, so it's my, really a personal as well as an intellectual pleasure for me to be able to introduce her today. Professor Ringer received her BA from Oberlin College and her PhD in history from UCLA, which perhaps tells you how we know each other. And she is her area of specialization is 19th and early 20th century Iran and then the Middle East more broadly. And she is the author of two fabulous books, which I recommend to you. The first one, the earlier one, Education, Religion, and the Discourse of Cultural Reform in Qajar, Iran, which really looked at, as the title suggests, the process of reforming the educational system in 19th century Iran, paying attention both to attempts to secularize the educational system and also to the intellectual evolution of the ulama as a part of that process. And her second book is called Pious Citizens, Reforming Zoroastrianism in India and Iran, which came out from Syracuse University Press in 2011. And she gave a talk here a couple of years back that touched on some of the subject matter of that book, so perhaps some of you will remember that. Her talk today is going to be entitled Defining Religion and Civilization in Imam Bayezidov's Refutation of Renan. And it is a step in a larger project that will be looking at the response of Middle Eastern intellectuals to the famous speech that Ernest Renan made at the Sorbonne in the 1880s, in which he claimed that Islam was inherently contradictory to the scientific endeavor, to the scientific spirit. And indeed that we hope and we intend that that larger project of looking at Mudafaname, rejections of Renan, is a project that we can turn into something larger together. So that's exciting for both of us, and it's therefore my pleasure to give you Professor Ringer.
Thank you, Holly, for your generous introduction, and also especially for proposing me to come out and be a visiting Islamic fellow and working on this project together. I'm very grateful to the members of the steering committee of the Mellon Islamic Initiatives program, in particular Professor Sells, Donner, Gutbudin, and Nuremberg, who invited me for this, and especially to the Divinity School and NELC for extending such a warm welcome. It's really an honor to be here. So don't be alarmed by this enormous sheaf of papers that I brought up with me. I don't want to wear glasses, so I printed it out in extremely large type, so that the size of the amount of paper that I brought up is not indicative of the length of my talk. As Holly began to mention, the famous lecture given at the Sorbonne by French religious studies scholar Ernest Renan in 1883, entitled Islam and Science, prompted a certain amount of consternation in Muslim intellectual circles and occasioned quite a few refutations. In many ways, the debate surrounding Renan's assertions resembled the Clash of Civilizations debate, engendered by Samuel Huntington's now infamous article published exactly 110 years later. Renan argued that Islam was what he termed an iron circle crowning the heads of Muslims that prevented rational and scientific thought, and which therefore accounted for Islamic society's backwardness vis-a-vis Europe. Renan's argument was a product of his two intellectual priorities. First, to fit Islam into his larger schema of religio-civilizational difference that could account for European superiority, and second, to demonstrate that religion, in his case, Roman Catholicism, needed to be rethought as a system of doctrine and dogma, and instead be reconceived as the moral underpinnings of society consistent with God's plan for the evolutionary progress of humanity. Renan's broader ideas concerning religion and rationalism found a ready audience amongst many of his Muslim refuters. In fact, they saw eye to eye on fundamental ideas concerning the nature of religion and religion's connection to the evolution of civilization and progress. In particular, his refuters were attracted to his attempt to reconcile religion and rationalism and to subject religious tradition and textual canon to critical inquiry. In their own writings, his refuters too railed against superstition, labored to divest jurisprudential method of blind adherence to tradition, and fought to disengage from dogmas and rituals that they believed were inimical to rationalism and ultimately modern scientific and moral progress. For all these reasons, the refutations, by and large, confine themselves to a rejection of Renan's assertion of Christian European exceptionalism. In other words, his claim that European races had the innate capacity to rationalize Christianity through critical inquiry, but that Semitic people could not undertake a similar project regarding Islam. His Muslim critics ignored race as irrelevant and insisted that Islam, like Catholicism, could be rationalized and could become no less a potent motor of civilization and progress. So the question is really not about religion per se and what modern religion or rational religion per se looked like. They tended to agree on that. What they disagreed with was that Islam could or could not, like Christianity, take new forms. The debates, I think, are a window onto the much broader conversations about religion and modernity that were taking place in the late 19th century. Conversations that span national borders and conversations that deserve much closer attention, and that's what Professor Schisler and I are all set to do. In particular, I'm intrigued by the shift in the understanding of the nature of religion itself in the 19th century amongst Muslim reformist intellectuals, and in the new methodology they deployed in their attempts to locate modernity in an Islamic context. Most Middle Eastern historians, and probably most of you, have heard of the Renan refutation written by his most famous interlocutor, here I use the term interlocutor, Jamaluddin al-Afghani, due in large part to Nikki Keddie's seminal work, and also to Charles Kurtzman's source books, which have made Afghani's and other Islamic modernist texts available to English reading audiences. Scholars are less familiar, however, with the several other refutations penned by Muslim intellectuals, or those composed by Renan's own Catholic critics, of which he had many. In this talk, I would like to examine one of the least well-known of the refutations, that written by Ataollah Bayezidof. Now, Bayezidof, who lived in the sort of latter half of the 19th century, was a Crimean Tatar and a well-respected religious figure in Russia, active in the movement to unify Muslims in the Russian Empire. He established and led the Second Muslim Congregation in St. Petersburg in 1871, served as the Muslim judge for the St. Petersburg garrison, and taught Islamic fundamentals, logic, and philosophy at both Muslim and non-Muslim educational institutions in the capital. He was on familiar terms with Ustrinsky and many other Russian intellectuals in the capital, even apparently personally knowing Prime Minister Stolypin. In 1805, after years of effort, he also received permission to establish a Muslim Tatar language periodical, Nur, which he proceeded to edit. He was instrumental in the fundraising and foundation of the very first mosque in St. Petersburg that was founded in 1910, where he was appointed as the first Imam and where he served out the last year of his life in that particular position. His several official semi-governmental positions enabled him to serve as an informal intermediary between Muslim communities in the empire and the Russian government. Nearly 10 years after reading a Russian translation of Renan's 1883 speech, he wrote and published in Russian a refutation, but sent along a copy to Ahmed Mithat Efendi, who was then the managing editor of the journal Terjemani Hakikat in Istanbul. There it was translated into Ottoman and published in the journal in 1892 as Islam and Civilization, a Refutation of Renan. And along with this refutation, Bayezidof included a second companion essay for publication entitled Islam's Relationship to Science. These twin essays go well beyond the rejection of Renan's disparaging conclusion that Islam was incompatible with science to deliberately explain what he calls the fundamental tenets of Islam to a European Christian audience. When I say European Christian audience, not because it was published in the journal Terjemani Hakikat in Istanbul, but because they were initially written in Russian and published in Russian. Both because they were written by a professional cleric, and for their lengthy discussions of Islam, these twin essays are a particularly rich source for 19th century Muslim modernist ideas concerning the nature of religion and its connection to civilization and progress. Bayezidof begins his refutation by accusing Renan, and European scholars more generally, of condemning Islam based on a dearth of serious scholarship. Had Renan only taken the time to investigate Islam thoroughly, Bayezidof laments, he would not have drawn such unfounded conclusions. In particular, he accuses Renan of cherry-picking evidence and contends that drawing conclusions about Islam's relationship to science from a conversation reputed to have occurred between an Englishman and a local judge in Iraq cannot possibly constitute serious scholarly inquiry. And of course, you're supposed to laugh because we would never use that as evidence these days. Bayezidof provides an alternative rereading of the purported conversation to argue persuasively that the judge in question clearly believed his interlocutor to be a British spy and accordingly did his best to prevent him from collecting any sensitive data. It is likely that the Qadi thought that the British man was a traveling missionary wanting to gather information on the living conditions of society, sectarian relations, statistics, and the economic situation, Bayezidof wrote. He was trying to say, don't interfere in our business. We have no intention of letting our country come under your control. Wasn't the Qadi correct, Bayezidof retorts, to perceive him as a traveler with political rather than scientific objectives? Bayezidof also questions Renan's logic in claiming that ancient Greek scientific advances somehow belong inherently to Europeans, but not equally so to Arabs. He readily concedes that Arab science was based on the foundation of Greek science, but then notes that first, Arabs significantly contributed to scientific advancements and were not merely a channel of transmission from Greece to Europe, and that second, it would be equally illogical for Europeans to claim sole paternity over Greek science, as it would for Arabs, since by nature all sciences build on each other and share Greek, Indian, Iranian, and other roots. Think of scientific foundations as parents, Bayezidof argues, quote, the child is European science whose father is Greek knowledge and whose Arab mother too contributed to the nurturing of the child, but whose participation goes completely unacknowledged, end quote. Bayezidof denounced Renan's claim that Islam is responsible for Islamic society's technological inferiority vis-a-vis Christian Europe as fallacious. Religion cannot be equated with social, political, and historical context. He contrasts Catholicism's deep enmity to sciences, both in past and present times, with Islam's encouragement of science and more generally civilization and progress. It was the Mongol invasions, he notes, that led to the downfall of sciences in Islamic lands, not Islam. The distinction between religion and historical context is a central feature of Bayezidov's argument. In other words, that religion cannot be conflated with the society in which it operates, that social context shapes the promotion of or hindrance of science, and that this is true in the Christian and Muslim cases. I wonder why, when Renan talks about an Islamic point of view, he says, he does not instead say a Jewish and Christian point of view. Bayezidof aptly demonstrates Renan's dubious logic, data, and conclusions. But more importantly, I think, than his deft refutation of Renan's Iron Circle thesis, Bayezidov's twin essays provide deeper insight into his ideas of religion and of religion's ultimate connection to civilization and progress. I'm particularly interested in interrogating his text with these two central questions in mind. First, how does he understand religion in general and Islam specifically? Second, does he posit a causal connection between religion and civilization? Bayezidof understands religion in a phenomenological sense rather than as a set of dogmas distinguished by their truth value. As the following passage illustrates, he emphasizes the inherently social and thus universal, almost deist nature of religion. Quote, "No society has been far from or without a religious foundation. Religion has satisfied the appropriate spiritual qualities, provided truths and their corollaries and moral feelings. It is for these reasons that it is not only in the past that religious life has provided for man's life, but it also retains enormous importance for the future," end quote. Religion provides individual, spiritual, moral, and social needs of mankind and is therefore of enduring value. It is also clear from this quotation that Bayezidof entertains a strongly anthropological conception of religion as a human phenomenon with a shared essence but different historically contingent manifestations. The fact that he makes a sharp distinction between religions that further individual morality and social progress, like Islam and other Abrahamic religions, over those that do not, for example, idolatry, suggests a theory of human as religious evolution from primitive to more advanced, although this is not an issue that he takes up explicitly. Bayezidof expends considerable effort stressing the fundamental commonality of the three Abrahamic religions. Unlike Renan, who insists on essential and thus irreconcilable differences between them, Bayezidof emphasizes their similarity. Islam shares a common Abrahamic heritage that respects and to some extent incorporates elements of the earlier Abrahamic religions. Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad are all brothers, Bayezidof insists. Accordingly, the distinguishing feature of Abrahamic religions is the fact and nature of the revelations themselves. Throughout his treatise, he contends that all three religions, as revealed religions, have innate tensions between revealed knowledge and knowledge derived through human reason. If revealed belief systems need to be subject to critical inquiry in order to reconcile these two epistemological methods, then this certainly holds true for all of them, not just Islam. Bayezidof says, why should Islam somehow be singled out from the others as inimical to science? Throughout both texts, Bayezidof does not so much define Islam as describe it, as, quote, "the last Prophet Muhammad's religious message that consists of the Quranic verses and the hadith that came from his own mouth." This descriptive definition, I think, is significant for what it omits, namely, no mention of Sharia, no mention of Islamic tradition, or even the concept of precedent as adherence to tradition, and no mention of doctrine, ritual, omar, any of the things that one might expect to see in a treatise about the fundamentals of Islam. Islam, again defined as the Quran and the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, and I underline this part, that came from his own mouth, implies a very specific understanding of the nature of God's relationship to mankind, the Quran and Hadith, as well as Quranic hermeneutics and Islamic methodology more generally. Bayezidof clearly perceives what he terms Islam's fundamental beliefs as having both historical and ahistorical components. On the one hand, the Quran as the message of God contains God's purpose or intent for mankind, the essence of Islam that transcends historical time and is thus both unchanging and eternally relevant. On the other hand, prophetic hadith are the outward manifestations of the prophet's understanding of the Word of God designed to meet particular needs of his own time. The acknowledgement of the contextual nature of the prophet's actions emphasizes the imperative of distinguishing between eternal and historical, between God's universal intent and the implementation of this intent in historical time. Methodologically, this means that neither the Quran nor the Hadith can be read literally in the absence of the recovery of this intent, extrapolated yet also clearly divorced from historical context. A recovery of divine intent necessitates the archaeological extraction of its essence, or its purpose, from historically contingent references and applications. Any hermeneutics of the Quran is contingent on this process. Islamic authority is located in both the Quran and prophetic Hadith, but both sources require interrogation and cannot be deployed literally or used uncritically as a historically valid legal precedent. Bayezidov's emphasis on the historicity of both the Quran and prophetic Hadith leave little room for the authority of non-prophetic Hadith, tradition as legal precedent, or received doctrinal orthodoxy. The Quran and Hadith must be subject to rational scrutiny and their divine intentionality extracted from their historical applications. Tradition is thus dissolved through historicism and rejected as a method of arriving at truth, or as I like to term it, God's intent. The primacy of the Quran as the location of God's intent involves the retrieval of its intent from its contextual manifestation. And this entails a re-examination of traditional interpretations of Islam in order to disengage their religious essence from prior interpretations manifest as contextually specific set of behaviors, rituals, and doctrines. Bayezidov's deeply historicized understanding of Islam is reinforced through his repeated references to Islam's fundamental beliefs as constituting divine prompts towards ethical behavior, both individually and socially. Islam's essence, in his view, is a divine mandate to the cultivation of individual character and morality as a motor of larger social progress. Bayezidov casts the Prophet in the role of shaping individual characters and sensibilities, and in so doing, of striving to lift his own society out of ignorance. The Prophet becomes the mediator between divine intent as manifest in the Quran and the needs and limitations of his own historical moment. To take one example, Bayezidov cites a hadith in which the Prophet encourages internalization of the Quran as God's intent. Quote, "The Prophet said to Abu Zar, 'If every morning you learn a verse of the Quran, this would be preferable to 100 prostrations in prayer.'" End quote. Ritual devotion, then, conceived by Bayezidov, is only one possible manifestation of God's intent for man, one way of worshiping, and one that exists independently of individual consciousness of the intent behind the ritual. However, the comprehension of the Word of God itself, and thus, in a sense, the internalization of the intent behind it, is clearly preferable to the performance of the ritual itself, which is in contrast is cast as routine, devoid of the consciousness of its ultimate objective. The emphasis on divine intent as the shaping of individual subjectivities pervades Bayezidov texts, particularly in the fourth section devoted to an explanation of, quote, the Prophet's moral directives. In this section, he claims that the Prophet emphasized the creation of moral individuals and their salutary effect on society as a whole. Accordingly, the Prophet said, quote, "In my religion, two things are the most important. One is good temperament, the other is generosity," end quote. Bayezidov follows this hadith by stating that, quote, "good morals, good relationships, neighborliness, and family relations make for good viziers, civil servants, and national happiness, and people's lives are blessed." That would be Bayezidov's quote, right? Not the Prophet. 19 short sections, each subtitled with the virtue promoted by Islam, immediately follow the statement. And the virtues include politeness and modesty, sincerity, moderation and gentleness, kindness, and Islamic injunctions concerning family relations and women. This last section is particularly revealing of Bayezidov's overall conception of Islam and his distinction between the essence of Islam as divine intent and the social context in which the Prophet operated. Bayezidov opens the subsection entitled Islam's Approach to the Issue of Women in the Family by asserting that the intent of the Quran was to improve the situation of women in the family in 7th century Arabia. Parsing the Quranic verse 4:3 concerning the possibility of a man having more than as many as 4 wives, Bayezidof insists that the intent of God to limit men to 1 wife in the context of a rampantly polygamous society is evident. He thereby deploys a new Islamic methodology, premised on the retrievability of divine intent from historical context and the extrapolation of the ethical injunctions behind it. He also employs historical evidence to justify the reading of God's intent as the improvement of the status of women, by citing the prophet's concurrence with this interpretation, evidence as his own attempts to improve the status of women in his society. I quote Basidov, "Marrying lots of wives did not originate in Islam, but was already the case amongst the polytheists and Jews. The prophet limited it and put so many clear restrictions on marriage to second and subsequent women that it became very difficult to actually do so," end quote. Europeans are mistaken in attributing the low status of women to Islam, Bayezidof counters, since clearly in both the Quran as divine intent and prophetic as historical action, Islam improved women's rights and established rules and law that provided them more freedoms than they had previously enjoyed. Then he goes on to contrast and say, in fact, more freedoms than they were allowed in Christian Europe. Therefore, Islam certainly can't be denigrated as sort of anti-women's status. God's intent is thus explained as the creation of individual ethical consciousness and the concomitant civilizational progress of society. This, in Bayezidov's view, was the ultimate purpose of God's revelation. Quote, "In the Jahiliyyah period, there was continuous warfare and conflict," he wrote. "The prophet changed everything, brought peace and the end of conflict, cleansed the entire Arabian desert of idols and their sites of worship, inaugurated a new era. The prophet's religious message brought everyone together as fellow countrymen. Religion and morality were purified, and souls were adorned with efforts in sciences. In these ways, they caught up with the intellectual advances of the Byzantines," end quote. Now note the specific advancements listed by Bayezidof above in describing the effect of God's revelation: peace, fraternity, brotherhood, individual and social morality, together contributing to scientific advancement. As Bayezidof concludes unequivocally, quote, "Islam contributed to the promotion of civilizational progress." And this is where I pass through some enormous amounts of pages. Bayezidov's position on the causal connection between religion and civilization and progress is a nuanced one. On the one hand, he does not argue that civilization is solely a function of the evolutionary stage of a given religion. Yet on the other hand, he does believe that religion, Islam, can and did contribute to Abbasid civilization and scientific progress at the time. In his discussion of Catholicism's relationship to science, Bayezidof points to specific instances of intolerance and incompatibility, both in the past, citing the Inquisition and church opposition to Luther, and in the present. But he does not explain religious opposition to science in either essentialist or evolutionary terms. Rather, Bayezidof insists that all revealed religions have tensions between truth bestowed via divine revelation and truth derived through human intellect. They all struggle to reconcile reason and revelation, the divine with empiricism and rationalism. True religion, he maintains, the essential fundamental beliefs of Islam, can be valid and true. In other words, can be reconciled to reason and natural law if they are not confounded with superstition and other elements which are not part of religion. When religion is correctly understood, it is perfectly compatible with science and reason, so the challenge facing contemporary scholars is not to reconcile religion to science, but to clarify the boundaries of religion, what is and what isn't. Religion, Bayezidof insists, is limited to a set of divine prompts to ethical behavior, civil progress, and civilization. Confounding religion with its practice over time, misunderstandings, or culture is to do it an injustice. Bayezidof is very clear in rejecting both Christian and Islamic exceptionalism. European civilization and scientific advancements are not due to Catholicism, nor is the relative backwardness of Islamic societies a result of Islam. Rather, historical factors contribute to the degree of civilization and progress in a society. Religion alone is not the sole determinant of progress or decline. In conclusion, where does this all leave us? And I'd just like to offer two brief comments. First, implicit in Bayezidof is a new conceptualization of the individual in society, or perhaps more accurately, of the individual in society. His conception of religion implicitly emphasizes the individual and individual consciousness as both the subject and object of divine intervention in this world via revelation. The cultivation of new subjectivities is fundamental to the correct performance of religion, as performance itself is reconceived as the manifestation of a conscious ethical commitment and the divine intent itself, and the relegation of performance as ritual to realms of lesser consciousness. At the same time, society is reimagined as the collective of conscious individuals, as opposed to a community of faithful, the Ummah. Although Basidov does not elaborate, unfortunately, the question becomes whether or not all individuals enjoy the authority to interpret the Quran without clerical mediation, and with this can claim legislative capacity. Bayezidof doesn't comment, but this is, of course, some of what is at stake in these new ideas of individualism. And here I'm obviously referencing the idea of constitutionalism. Can or can society not legislate on its own behalf? Finally, I'm beginning really where I left off in my last book that explored 19th century Zoroastrian religious reform, and arguing that Islamic modernism, which is typically explained as a reconciliation of Islam with modernity, was not simply an instrumentalist attempt to realign Islam with modern values, but instead involved a more fundamental shift in the assumptions concerning the nature of religion that lay behind the development of new social and political objectives. In other words, while it is certainly true that these scholars wrote about the compatibility of Islam with constitutionalism, science, and women's rights, these claims were the products of a new conception of religion and new processes of Islamic thought premised on concepts of rationalism and historicism. Islamic modernism was not simply the use of religious language to better align Islam with modern values and institutions, but instead a serious theological project that resulted in a fundamental rethinking of the nature of religion, of Islam, of Islamic tradition, and Islamic methodology, one that was equally as revolutionary, if not more so, than the socio-political reforms that were buttressed by these new theoretical premises. Thank you.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about Bayezidov's intellectual heritage and lineage. Like, for example, where did he study? With whom did he study? What kind of origins or back projections can you?
Well, it's a fabulous question, and I have to say I'm hoping that you guys can help me, because I don't read Russian. And I've done a preliminary sort of Russian search of Bayezidof and found very, very basic material about him. Dug around in some stuff about Gasprinsky and not bumped into Bayezidof really anywhere. So I don't know where he studied. I don't know what the curriculum was of what he taught beyond these sort of types of things. And it's been very difficult for me really to piece together his own field and his sorts of interactions with other intellectuals. But that really is the key.
Because I mean, the picture that you portray of him seems to suggest a very well-developed form of discourse that had been probably been developing for a good long while, I'm guessing.
Right. I mean, you know, these kinds of things are going on all over the Middle East, Central Asia, and Afghanistan. And so he's certainly part of a larger conversation. I think he's also likely to be rather politic, because he did have governmental position to open a journal. He did receive governmental permission to establish a mosque. And so he's not a radical, he's not solely an intellectual without governmental ties in a sense of his kind of intermediary obligations. So in some sense, if you view him as very moderate and negotiating, I think that suggests where one might find more strident positions on the other end of Bayezidof, that he may be somewhere in a sort of middle consensus on many of these things. He also, of course, doesn't use Islamic terminology, but you have other scholars writing in a similar period that will actually say, instead of, tradition, they will talk about taqlid and ijtihad and stuff like that. He doesn't, and I think that's because of the audience for whom he's writing. It's not as though he's unaware of the parallel. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your contribution. I'm curious, I guess on behalf of my own interests, did his program of refuting Renan and claiming science and modernization of Islamic terms, did that have a practical impact in how he thought about, say, education or Islamic law, given his position in the Russian Muslim community? Footnote to that, I don't know what that would have been at this particular time. Like, were Muslims given separate schools? Did they have the authority or ability to have schools and courts, as is the case in the Mediterranean, separating religious sort of spheres that way?
Right. Well, I mean, you do have the whole Jadidist movement going on, you know, in the Russian context, with new schools being established. You know, because he works at sort of government institutions and not schools associated with the Muslim community itself necessarily, but semi-governmental positions, I don't know how that would impact the curriculum as opposed to, say, you know, Jadidist schools established in Tajikistan or something that may have had more independence from the government. I mean, he is in the capital, he is sort of serving the government at some level. But I really don't know that much about it. And so I bumped into his refutation, you know, because Professor Schisler and I have compiled all the refutations and sort of reading through them. And his was the one that appealed to me because some of the others don't talk that much about Islam. You know, they basically say, Renan, what kind of scholar is he? You know, he doesn't know anything. But there's nothing else there. Now, I shouldn't say that because we're about to write a book on the refutation. But, I mean, there is stuff there, but it's not so overtly about Islam as Bayezidof actually does. I mean, Name Kamal just says, oh, you know, Renan is such an Orientalist. But there's not a full discussion of Islam that accompanies it. So I was intrigued by that and sort of piecing that through really in the context of larger Islamic modernist thought. But I don't have enough material yet on the Russian context and him himself to think about it in a more specific context. So it's both very good questions.
Do you have any sense of if these concepts of historicism and rationalism, he's deriving them from resources which are internal to the tradition or from European thought?
That's an excellent question. I mean, definitely from within the tradition.
On these two concepts.
Right. Well, definitely from within the tradition. I mean, I have a section I didn't read because I worried about wearying you on a Friday afternoon. But he uses Al-Ghazali actually. He quotes Al-Ghazali and says, oh, Al-Ghazali says, you know, logic is paramount. You have to learn logic before you can learn anything else. It's the sort of foundation of the rest of the sciences. And really equates that claim to the primacy of logic with a very different conception of rationalism, critical inquiry, natural law, and all those sorts of things.
And ethics and individual as well.
Right. Right. So, you know, he does cite the Hadith, he does cite earlier Islamic scholars, he does cite the Quran, but the citations that he uses are sort of glossed in a very different way than they typically are. He does also maintain, for example, the sort of empirical data of how Islam clearly contributed to Abbasid science, and has, you know, pages and pages that also reference European scholars saying the same thing. But that's a different question than the origins of sort of rationalism. Sir?
If he's talking about the application of divine intent to an historical context, did he give any indication or recommendation about how Islamic principles would be applied to the modern context?
Mm-hmm. No, he doesn't. And I'm really looking beneath the lines of his text to argue that he, in a sense, is implying that one has to first identify what the intent is in the Quran or in the Prophet's own actions as the understanding of the Quran, and then determine the essential ethical principles and intents that lay behind them, which then, in a sense, have to be reapplied in different contexts. So the implication for Islamic law would be, these are the guiding principles. In different contexts, they would be applied very differently. And in a sense, a permanently ongoing conversation between the sort of eternal ethical momentum and how they would then be manifest in different places and different times.
Do you have a sense of whether the other refutations were aware of his reputation? Do they cite him either as an individual or his particular reputation?
No, they don't. I mean, I think the refutation that was likely to be read by some of the other refuters was the Al-Afghani one, simply because of the nature of Al-Afghani himself, the fact that it was published very quickly thereafter, the fact that Renan then had a rejoinder to that, the fact that he traveled so internationally. It's clear that the publishers at the Terjemani Hakikat, Ahmed Bayezidof and others, were very aware of Renan, were very aware of Al-Afghani, and thought very highly of Bayezidof, and that's why they published it. At the time, some of the others really hadn't been published. So he's coming really on as the second published refutation. If you look, basically what I'm trying to argue is that if you look at contemporary Islamic modernism, and here, one of the books that I keep coming back to, which I'm sure you'll all appreciate, is Fazlur Rahman's Islam and Modernity, published in 1983, 1982. And of course, he was a University of Chicago scholar. And I read that as an undergraduate, and he has a much more honed methodology. I mean, it's an overt methodology that he proposes. The 19th century Islamic modernists don't. It's not clear to me that they are as conscious of the methodology as the methodology is implicit in some of their premises. So I don't want to imply that he's trying to articulate a very clear methodology so much as I'm saying by his emphasis on historicism, and that therefore leads him to reject tradition as precedent. Implicit in that, sort of the next step, would be therefore implications for Islamic law and so forth. They don't always connect all of the dots, but underlying these assumptions about how religion operates in the world and how we need to read the Quran is a much more fundamental methodology. Aisha.
Professor, thank you very much for the talk, and you might have mentioned it, but do you know whether is there any reference to who translated it to, because you said he wrote in Russian, right? And then that was published in America. So that would be in Ottoman Turkish. Do we have any information about who might have translated the text?
Yes.
Or whether he wrote it in Ottoman Turkish?
Yes, no, he didn't. He sent it in Russian. And a woman named Olga Davidov, I think it was, I have the footnote, who, according to the editors of the journal, she was a Russian woman, quote-unquote, Orientalist, who seemed to be hanging around Istanbul, and she very kindly offered to translate it, and they took her up on it. As you have her name.
Carter Quinley wrote a whole article about her. Madame Golnar.
Yes.
Sometimes called Madame Golnar.
Yes, Madame Golnar.
And any reference to the genre of refutation itself in Islamic tradition, or like is it just specific? how much emphasis does he put on the fact that the text that he's writing is a refutation, and whether he's making any references to the genre or to the tradition of refutation itself?
He doesn't, he doesn't talk about that at all. It's just the editors in the Ottoman translation that say, oh, this was sent in by Bayezidof, and we very happily had someone on hand to translate. It was Golnar Hanım Efendi, Madame Olga Delavidoff. So they think her and say, well, that really saved us from having to do it. But he doesn't position himself in a tradition of, Mudafa'a Name literature or anything else. He doesn't reference anything. He just says, I'm so upset and so disappointed and really hurt by Renan's words that are incredibly unfair and show that there's really an agenda of European scholars against Islam that can't possibly be based on serious scholarship. So he writes in his sort of introduction as saying how hurt he is and that he's there to sort of correct some of the obvious flaws in Renan's argument. And then I also have a piece, he says, on Islamic fundamentals that I'd like to share to sort of correct the record.
Can I ask some more?
Sure.
Why does he have to, you've emphasized that he sort of has something against ritual and practice.
Mm-hmm.
His is a very intellectualist, basically, view of religion. Why does he have to make this move? I mean, what kind of, basically, yield does he get from making that move? I mean, he could hold a rationalist position in the sense of denying precedent. And in the traditional but without actually sort of denigrating the centrality of practice and ritual in that sense. So is this part of the refutation? Is this a central component of the refutation for him? This sort of very intellectualist view of religion? And what do you think? You started the talk by mentioning Huntington.
Yes.
Because obviously these are questions that still have a lot of political stakes as well. I mean, are you thinking of this, you and Holly, in terms of the kinds of interventions that this book seeks to actually do, apart from the historiographical one, in terms of Islamic modernism? I mean, Islam modernism.
I think we're further along than we are.
I really just want to emphasize that that Islamic modernism in the 19th century was a serious theological project. Because one tends to say, oh, reformers, they use Islam, they legitimize this, they legitimize that, but no one takes them seriously. It's sort of looked at as, oh, you can have an Islamic justification for constitutionalism without recognizing that that's in part a shift in religion. So I really want to uncover this sort of sea change going on really worldwide in conceptualizing the nature of religion in a really post-scientific revolutions, post-enlightenment period that does emphasize individual consciousness and sort of internalization as fundamental to religion itself, as a more advanced form of religiosity and spirituality. But one, of course, that's paralleled in the sort of political and social reform world by the emphasis on reaching the individual as a motor of change for society. But this is the sort of reaching of the internal consciousness of the individual to change and form new characters that can operate in new ways in new societies. So elsewhere I argue that it's really fundamental to secularism and the citizen, that you have to form new attitudes and sensibilities of individuals in order for them to behave as citizens. And there's a deep religious basis to that.
I think that also, if I may say, that not in these particular refutations, but in other sort of reformist literature of the period, there's a strong anti-clerical tone often, and a kind of underlying claim on the part of reformers who are profoundly committed to religion themselves, that there is a sort of class of corrupt religious practitioners who are not well educated and who use religious practice based on tradition or false interpretation of tradition or false application of tradition in a way that damages society and enriches them personally. So there's some aspect there of, being engaged in a project to think about what religion really is or what God's intention really is, as a way, among other things, to cleanse religion of these people who are often disparagingly referred to as ahuns, who are, sort of the witch doctors of Islamic practice or something, and I think that's the kind of implication. So there's a way that those people are, I think, then characterized as emphasizing blind practice. Practice, a content-free practice, right?
But their authority can be challenged if individuals are able to interpret.
But that seems a very modernist move, I mean, in
Right,
that
yeah.
sense. I mean, a very Durkheimian as well, in the sense of...
It's a Kantian.
So a Kantian.
It's a Kantian.
Yeah. And Durkheim in the sense of religion becoming more and more individual,
Function.
more personal. Yeah.
So all these things are paired, there's the structural anti-clericalism, but it's sort of grounded in hermeneutics and the individual. So, we're arguing that that's really been the overlooked part of the story.
So in terms of the individualized authority that comes about of his vision, kind of a rationalized Islam and detraditionalized Islam, what does he kind of deal with the issue of then what gives him the authority to dispute the original Western critiques of Islam? I mean, why does then? I mean, isn't it in a sense cutting the legs out from under him and saying that his interpretation is actually just as authoritative as his rival that he's trying to read against?
Well, you've kind of put your finger on the problem then, that becomes, how does one ascertain what's essential and eternal versus what's non-essential and contextual, and who gets to do it? And that remains a problem of religious authority. And people saying, oh, well, that part's contextual, we don't need it, and other people saying, well, it's not. So that's the hubris of this kind of movement of saying, well, it's easy to ascertain God's intent here. But it's not necessarily uncontroversial. There's always a weak point in any argument, right? And that's certainly theirs. Yes.
I'm just curious, if you say, I don't know this stuff at all. I used to be in the Middle Ages. But you say Renan answered this, answered Afghan.
Right.
So how does he answer? Does he just ignore that or say, you don't understand your own tradition? Or?
Well, Afghani gives a kind of a different response than Bayezidof does. And the two had met. And in fact, the story goes that Renan gave the talk in the first place because he was so impressed with Afghani and said, well, you're different because, Iranians are different because they're Aryan and so there's some hope. But also, Afghani really argues, you're right, you're basically right, that Islam and science are at present inimical. But what you're mistaken in seeing is that these religions are both on a sort of evolutionary continuum, and Christianity has gone through a process that Islam has not yet gone through. So he says, you're right and you're wrong.
And then Renan comes back and says...
And then Renan comes back and says, how impressive you are, and basically... So sorry. Yeah, sorry, but he doesn't answer any of the other refutations.
Thank you.
So I came in a bit late, so I apologize if you covered this in the first part of your lecture. But is there kind of a questioning by Bayezidof, sorry, I can't pronounce his name correctly, but how he sort of, does he question what modernity actually is? Is there like a deeper discussion essence? Because there seem to be so many assumptions as to what is science, what is Islam, what is modernity. Like is there recognition of how perhaps there could be a more fundamental disagreement in the sort of, at least in the European style of thinking, of promoting the kind of scientific method, the very particular way of scientific thinking to kind of a larger worldview, whereas perhaps this hasn't been happening in the Islamic world, and there seems to be a little bit of they seem to be talking a little bit past each other and
Right.
assuming what is science and why is Islam incompatible with science if they're not defining the terms.
Right. Well, I mean, keep in mind that he doesn't address all of these things directly. You know, he's really just saying Renan hasn't understood Islam correctly. He doesn't talk overtly about what is modern or modernity or the criteria or anything like that. His explanation of sort of scientific difference and political power disparity is that it's really nothing to do with religion. These are other contingent issues, you know, like, well, he doesn't really spell them out, in fact. I mean, he doesn't actually say, now I'm going to address the disparity between the two cultures. But he does say, you know, well, it can't be Islam because under Islam, science reached its high point. So let's not even talk about that anymore. Although he then says, and of course, things fell apart with the Mongols, but that's not to do with Islam either. So I think his interest is really in saying, let's not follow this sort of European inclination to identify problems with religion. That these problems may be social and they may be political, but they're not religious. But at the same time saying, well, of course we do need to revise what we mean by religion. So he implicitly does accept that, you know, the clerics are a problem, tradition is a problem, the practice of Islam is a problem, but he refuses to accede that that is inherent to Islam.
Seems implicitly just accepting so much of the allegations that are being made. I don't know, it seems just that there seems to be an obsession so much with, you know, such a sensitivity to the critiques that are being made out of Europe.
Right.
By other, like you mentioned Fazl Rahman and other sort of reformers, and even not El-Afghani, they seem first off to be very focused on responding to these guys first off, but also the method through which they seem to be responding is also seeking to, at a very elite level, either capture the state or convince rulers otherwise. There doesn't seem to be much of an organic sort of pushback or social movement outside of that. I don't know if that's...
Well, in this particular text written for this particular audience, I mean, I think you're quite right, but of course there's all sorts of movements afoot at the very grassroots level to change the way people think about the tradition itself, the text, and that kind of thing. Yeah. So, both is true.
Just to say something additional to that, you know, one of the things that made me interested in this, well, not in Renan per se, but what would anybody mean by talking about modern religions and religion times? Right? Was this book by biography of Mary Mills Patrick, the American missionary from, I think from Illinois actually, who goes off to Erzurum in the 1870s. She taught, and she makes a comment just in passing in her autobiography about needing, you know, that some members of the missionary community that she's a part of have sort of embraced modern religion, but others haven't. And you think to yourself, what does she mean by that? But I guess I want to say that that question of, you know, in that late 19th century moment of what modern religion might be, and who's doing it right and who's doing it wrong is something that people are sensitive to in the Muslim Middle East, but also in other places. It's a larger movement.
This is when the higher criticism came online, right, in Christianity. We had huge battles about that, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, Renan himself is spending his entire life trying to argue the exact same thing in the Catholic context. And he's often labeled, an unbeliever. And of course, you only have to read 3 sentences to realize that, he's deeply committed to religion. So this project, again, is rather than a kind of whitewashing and fiddling with Islam to make it look better or more palatable for the sort of social religious reform agenda, I really think is a serious commitment to, in a sense, revivify Islam and commit to its relevance in modern society. And it's not a sort of instrumentalist, but we have to reconcile the rationalism, or what are we going to do about explaining religious difference. But instead, based on those assumptions that pretty much everyone has accepted, ideas of Darwinism, ideas of context, are not in question so much as what are the implications of those new assumptions for revising how we think about religion. And of course, morality is all the thing. I mean, if you're going to have a more secular state, what are you going to do with morality? So religion remains at that level as a very important component of even secular society. And of course, the individual becomes, the individual moral subject becomes very much the modern citizen. And what ranks religions within Christianity, even different religious traditions, as more or less progressive, is their ability to sort of generate more or less ethical individuals. Thank you very much.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.